Sometimes the most broken-looking things hold the greatest treasures, and sometimes it takes just one person to see past the surface. At the county livestock auction, laughter filled the ring when a shriveled donkey covered in crusty, yellowed patches was led forward. The auctioneer joked about starting bids at 5 cents for this half-dead creature. While ranchers mocked and jeered, a quiet drift rider named Elias knelt down beside the animal. He ran his thumb over one of those diseased-looking patches and froze. It wasn't mange. It was dried pine resin, hardened like armor, and trapped inside were thousands of raw gold flakes. Could this suffering animal actually be a living map to the richest gold strike in the territory? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The dust settled in Elias Crane's lungs, the way it always did after a long ride, familiar, unwelcome, and somehow comforting in its constancy. He stood at the edge of the auction grounds in Copper Ridge, Montana Territory, watching the morning sun climb over the Bitterroot Mountains. The year was 1889, and the world was changing faster than an old drift rider like him could quite keep pace with. Railroads now connected towns that used to take weeks to reach. Telegraph wires hummed with messages that once traveled by horseback. But here, in this dusty livestock yard, things moved at the same deliberate speed they always had. Elias was 53 years old, though his weathered face suggested a harder count. His hands bore the calluses and scars of a man who'd spent 3 decades working cattle, horses, and occasionally mules across some of the most unforgiving terrain the West had to offer. He wore a simple canvas jacket over a faded blue work shirt, both mended more times than he could remember. His hat, a wide-brimmed affair darkened by years of sweat and rain, sat low on his brow, shading eyes the color of slate in winter. He'd come to Copper Ridge for supplies, not livestock. His small homestead 40 miles north needed fence wire, flour, coffee, and little else. Elias lived simply, tending a modest herd of cattle and breaking the occasional horse for neighboring ranches when money ran thin. It was honest work, quiet work, and after the years he'd spent as a young man chasing dreams and fortunes across Colorado and Wyoming, he'd learned to appreciate the steady rhythm of a life that didn't ask for more than a man could give. The pocket watch in his vest belonged to his father, a railroad engineer who died when Elias was 16, crushed between 2 freight cars in a switching yard outside Omaha. The watch still kept perfect time, and Elias checked it now more out of habit than necessity. 8:30 in the morning. The livestock auction would start within the hour. Elias Crane, as I live and breathe. The voice belonged to Tom Hadley, a barrel-chested rancher with a thick grey beard and a laugh that could carry across a canyon. Tom owned the Triple H Ranch, one of the largest spreads in the territory, and he'd known Elias since both men were young enough to think they were invincible. Tom. Elias nodded, a faint smile crossing his weathered features. Heard you were expanding the herd. Trying to. Tom spat tobacco juice into the dust. Market's good right now, beef prices holding steady. Thought I'd pick up some breeding stock if the quality's decent. You buying or just watching? Just passing through. Needed supplies from Granger's store. Tom studied him for a moment, the way old friends do when they sense something left unsaid. You're looking thin, Elias. That homestead of yours feeding you proper? I eat fine. Stubborn as ever. Tom shook his head. Listen, I've got work if you want it. Good pay for a man who knows horses like you do. Winter's coming, and I'd rather see you working for me than scraping by on that patch of ground you call a ranch. Elias appreciated the offer, knew it came from genuine concern, but he also knew Tom well enough to recognize pity when he heard it. I'm managing, but I thank you for the thought. Before Tom could press the issue, a commotion rose from the auction ring. Laughter, sharp and mocking, the kind that cuts through the morning air like broken glass. Both men turned toward the sound. The ring was a circular enclosure of weathered wooden rails, packed dirt beneath, surrounded by a gallery of ranchers, cowboys, and speculators. At the center stood Marcus Belmont, the auctioneer, a lean man with a voice that could command attention in a thunderstorm. He gestured theatrically toward a livestock handler leading something into the ring. "Gentlemen," Marcus called out, barely suppressing his own amusement, "I present to you the finest specimen of equine excellence you're likely to see this season." More laughter erupted. Elias couldn't yet see what had provoked such reaction, but he felt Tom stiffen beside him. "Poor creature," Tom muttered. They moved closer, joining the crowd at the rail. That's when Elias saw the donkey. The animal was small, barely 13 hands high, with a coat that looked like something dredged from a nightmare. Where a healthy donkey should have displayed smooth grey or brown fur, this creature was covered in irregular patches of what appeared to be diseased, yellowed scabs. The patches ranged from the size of a silver dollar to areas as large as a man's hand, clustered thickest along the animal's shoulders, flanks, and hindquarters. Beneath these crusty formations, the visible skin looked raw and inflamed. But it was the donkey's overall condition that drew the cruelest mockery. His ribs showed clearly through the patchy coat. His head hung low, ears drooping in what seemed like exhaustion or defeat. One eye appeared clouded, and he moved with a pronounced limp in his left rear leg. "Mange," someone called from the crowd. "Put the poor thing out of its misery." "Look at those patches," another voice chimed in. "That's the worst case I've ever seen." Marcus Belmont played to his audience like a seasoned showman. Now, gentlemen, every animal deserves a fair chance. This fine specimen comes to us from the Whitaker Ranch, where apparently he wandered in last month and decided to make himself at home. Nobody's claimed him, so here we are. What am I bid for this?" He paused for effect. "Magnificent creature." The laughter swelled again. Someone shouted, "I'll give you a nickel to haul him away." Elias watched the donkey, something tugging at the edges of his attention. The animal's eyes, despite the clouded appearance, held a certain alertness. The way he stood, weight shifted off that rear leg, suggested pain but not weakness. There was something about those patches, too, something that didn't quite fit with the diagnosis of mange being thrown around so casually. Tom leaned in close. "Cruel business, making sport of a suffering animal." "It is," Elias agreed quietly. Marcus was warming to his performance. "Come now, surely one of you kind-hearted souls can spare a few coins for this." He squinted at a piece of paper in his hand. "This male donkey of undetermined age and questionable health. I'm authorized to start the bidding at 5 cents. Yes, you heard correctly. 5 cents. That's less than a cup of coffee, gentlemen." More jeering, more laughter. Some of it was good-natured, the kind of humor that comes easy at a rural auction, but some of it had a harder edge, the sort that finds entertainment in suffering. Elias found himself moving toward the ring before he'd consciously decided to do so. Tom called after him, but the words didn't register. He reached the rail and leaned over, getting a better look at the donkey. The animal turned slightly, and their eyes met. For just a moment, Elias felt that strange current of recognition that sometimes passes between a man and an animal, a sense of understanding that transcends species. The donkey's coat, upon closer inspection, showed variations in the patches that struck Elias as odd. Some were definitely organic in appearance, consistent with disease or parasites. But others had a different quality, more uniform, almost sculptural in the way they caught the light. The yellowed color wasn't the sickly pale of infection, but something richer, more golden. The thought arrived unbidden, and Elias pushed it away as fanciful. But his curiosity was fully engaged now. He'd worked with enough livestock to know mange when he saw it, and something about this didn't track right. "Marcus," he called out, his voice cutting through the ambient noise. "Can I come down there and take a closer look?" The auctioneer's eyebrows shot up. "Well now, we have an interested party. By all means, Mr. Crane. Come see if you can find any redeeming qualities in this sorry example of God's creation." More laughter, but Elias ignored it. He climbed over the rail and dropped into the ring, landing with a soft grunt. His knees weren't what they used to be. He approached the donkey slowly, making himself small and non-threatening, murmuring low sounds that had calmed countless nervous animals over the years. The donkey didn't shy away. If anything, he seemed almost relieved to have someone approach him with something other than mockery or pity. Elias came alongside the animal and placed a hand gently on his neck, feeling the warmth beneath that strange, crusty coat. Up close, the patches were even more intriguing. Elias ran his fingers carefully over one of the larger formations on the donkey's shoulder. The texture was hard, almost resinous, and when he pressed firmly, he felt it crack slightly, the way dried sap does when you break it away from bark. Sap, pine sap. His heart rate picked up, just slightly. He moved to another patch, this one on the donkey's flank. Same texture, same hardness. But there was something embedded in the sap, something that caught the morning light and threw it back with a particular luster. Elias glanced around the ring. All eyes were on him, waiting for him to finish his inspection and pronounce the obvious verdict. This animal was diseased, worthless, and should be put down. No one was paying attention to what his hands were doing, the way his thumb worked at one of the crusty patches. Carefully, methodically, a small piece broke free. He palmed it, keeping his movements casual, and brought it close to his face as if examining the donkey's eye. In the morning sunlight, the piece told him everything he needed to know. It was dried pine resin, amber in color, and trapped within its translucent depths were dozens of tiny flakes that glinted with unmistakable brilliance. Gold, raw gold, the kind that comes from a vein so pure and so exposed that it sheds its wealth into the water and soil around it. This donkey hadn't been rolling in disease, he'd been rolling in fortune. Elias's mind raced, connecting pieces of a puzzle he hadn't known existed 5 minutes ago. Somewhere in these mountains, probably in the high country where pine forests grew thick and ancient, there was a seep or a spring where gold-bearing rock met the surface. The kind of place where prospectors dreamed of finding, but rarely did. The kind of place where a donkey, seeking relief from flies or heat, might roll in the mud and emerge wearing a fortune. He straightened slowly, his expression carefully neutral. The crowd watched expectantly. "Well," Marcus called, "what's your professional opinion, Mr. Crane?" Elias took his time responding, stroking the donkey's neck thoughtfully. "He's in rough shape, no question, but I don't think it's mange." "No," Marcus sounded skeptical. "What is it then?" "Hard to say without a closer examination. Might be some kind of skin condition from bad water or poor grazing. Might be he got into something up in the hills." He shrugged. "Could probably be cleaned up with enough patience and the right treatment." This pronouncement was met with general disbelief and scattered laughter. "Clean him up," someone called. "You'd spend more on soap than the animal's worth." "Probably," Elias agreed mildly. He turned to Marcus. "What are you asking?" The auctioneer's face registered surprise, then calculation. "Well now, seeing as you're the only one with any interest, and seeing as the Whitakers just want him gone, I'm authorized to accept any reasonable offer. I'll give you $1. The crowd erupted in laughter again, harder this time. $1 for a diseased donkey was either an act of charity or lunacy, and the general consensus seemed to lean toward the latter. Marcus grinned widely. "Sold to Elias Crane for $1. Sir, you are now the proud owner of," he consulted his paper again, "this nameless male donkey. May the good Lord have mercy on your judgment." Tom Hadley appeared at the rail, shaking his head. "Elias, what in heaven's name are you doing?" Elias handed over a silver dollar to the auction clerk and accepted a bill of sale. "Something I should have done more often in my life, Tom. Taking a chance." He led the donkey out of the ring, aware of the eyes following him, aware of the whispered conversations already spreading through the crowd. Let them talk, let them laugh. He had work to do, and if he was right about what he'd discovered, if this animal really was a living map to a gold strike, then everything was about to change. Elias led the donkey away from the auction grounds, acutely aware of the stairs, and whispered comments following them down Copper Ridge's main street. The animal walked with that pronounced limp, favoring his left rear leg, but there was nothing defeated in his bearing now. If anything, he seemed almost eager to be moving, as if he understood that his circumstances had just improved. 3 blocks from the auction house, Elias turned down a narrow alley that led to the livery stable where he'd left his horse that morning. The stable belonged to a man named Vernon Pike, a former cavalry farrier who'd settled in Copper Ridge after his discharge. Vernon had a reputation for discretion and a talent for minding his own business qualities Elias valued highly at the moment. "That the diseased animal from the auction?" Vernon asked, looking up from the hoof he was trimming. He was a compact man in his 40s, with strong hands and observant eyes. "It is." Vernon set down his tools and approached slowly, professional interest overcoming his natural reticence. He circled the donkey, taking in the patchy coat and general condition. "Doesn't look like mange to me. Seen plenty of mange in the cavalry. This is something else." "My thinking too," Elias said carefully. "Mind if I use your back pen for a few hours? I'd like to examine him properly. Maybe clean him up some." "Help yourself. There's a water trough out there and brushes in the tack room. You need anything else, just holler." Elias led the donkey to the small enclosure behind the stable, a space sheltered from view by the building itself and a tall fence. Once they were alone, he spent several minutes just observing the animal, letting his initial excitement settle into careful analysis. The donkey stood patiently, occasionally turning his head to regard Elias with those surprisingly alert eyes. The crusty patches covered approximately 30% of the animal's body, concentrated mostly along the back, shoulders, and hindquarters, exactly where a donkey would be most likely to accumulate material if he were rolling on the ground. The distribution pattern told its own story. This wasn't disease spreading across skin. This was external coating, accumulated over time through repeated contact with the same source. Elias retrieved a stiff brush from the stable and began working on one of the smaller patches low on the donkey's left flank. The animal stood still, even leaning slightly into the brush strokes, as if welcoming the attention. The dried resin was stubborn, but not impossible to remove. Flakes began to fall away, and with them came more of those golden glints. He worked for 20 minutes, focusing on a single patch about the size of his palm. When he'd removed most of the resin, he examined what remained. The donkey's skin underneath was healthy, slightly irritated from the coating perhaps, but showing no signs of infection or disease. And there, scattered across the exposed area like stars in a night sky, were dozens of tiny gold flakes embedded in the remaining resin. Elias took out his pocket knife and carefully scraped some of the flakes into his palm. They were real, raw placer gold, the kind that washes free from larger deposits and collects in stream beds and muddy seeps. He'd done enough prospecting in his younger days to recognize it instantly, but this wasn't like anything he'd encountered before. The concentration was remarkable, more gold in this single patch than most prospectors found in a week of panning. His hands trembled slightly as he folded the knife closed and pocketed the gold flakes. This changed everything. If the donkey had been rolling in a single location and animals were creatures of habit, they returned to places that brought them comfort or relief. Then that location contained enough gold-bearing resin to coat an animal, which meant the source, the actual vein or deposit, had to be substantial. The question was, where? Elias stepped back and regarded the donkey with new eyes. The Whitakers had found him wandering onto their property a month ago. The Whitaker Ranch lay to the northeast of Copper Ridge, tucked against the foothills of the Bitterroot Mountains. That was high country, heavily forested with pine, cut through with dozens of streams and seeps that fed down from the peaks. Somewhere in that vast wilderness was the place this donkey called home. "You know where it is, don't you?" Elias said softly. "You know exactly where that gold is." The donkey flicked his ears forward, attentive. A knock on the fence post made Elias turn. Tom Hadley stood there, hat in hand, looking both concerned and curious. "Figured I'd find you here. Vernon said you were cleaning up your new acquisition." "Tom, mind if I come in?" Elias hesitated, then nodded. Tom entered the pen and approached the donkey slowly, extending a hand for the animal to sniff. "He doesn't look quite as bad up close. You were right about it not being mange. Pine resin, mostly. Probably rolled in a muddy seep somewhere up in the mountains." Tom examined one of the patches more closely, running his fingers over the crusty surface. For a moment, Elias tensed, wondering if his old friend would notice what he'd noticed. But Tom's attention was on the animal's overall health, not the contents of the coating. "Poor fellow's half-starved," Tom observed. "Probably been wandering for weeks before the Whitakers found him. You planning to keep him?" "I am." "What for? You don't need a pack animal. Your place barely supports the cattle you've got." Elias chose his words carefully. "Sometimes you help a creature because it's the right thing to do, not because there's profit in it." Tom studied him for a long moment, and Elias could see his friend weighing whether to press the issue. Finally, Tom smiled. "You always did have a soft spot for the underdogs, just like that three-legged dog you kept when we were young. Skipper, he was a good dog." "He was useless," Tom said, but not unkindly. "But you loved him anyway." He clapped Elias on the shoulder. "Well, if you're determined to keep this fellow, at least let me give you some feed for him. I've got extra alfalfa at the ranch. Consider it a gift between friends." "I appreciate that, Tom." After Tom left, Elias spent another hour working on the donkey, cleaning away more of the resin, examining the animal's injured leg, which proved to be a minor strain, nothing serious, and generally taking stock of his new responsibility. The donkey was younger than he'd first appeared, probably 5 or 6 years old, with good teeth and a solid frame beneath the neglect. With proper feed and care, he'd recover quickly. But feeding and caring for the donkey wasn't Elias's primary concern. What occupied his thoughts was the decision that now lay before him. He could try to backtrack the donkey's path, let the animal lead him to the source of the gold. If he was right, if there really was a significant deposit up there, it could mean wealth beyond anything he'd known. Enough to secure his homestead, enough to live comfortably for whatever years remained to him. Or he could walk away, sell the donkey to someone who'd treat him kindly, go back to his quiet life, and forget he'd ever run his thumb over that crusty patch and seen gold winking back at him. The safe choice was obvious. Elias had seen what gold fever did to men. He'd watched friends destroy themselves, chasing strikes that never panned out. He'd seen partnerships dissolve into violence over claim disputes. He'd seen the way wealth, or even the promise of wealth, could poison a person's soul. But he'd also seen what poverty did, the slow grinding down of hope, the narrowing of possibilities, the way a man's world could shrink year by year until it was just him and his failures, and nothing left to show for a lifetime of honest work. He looked at the donkey, and the donkey looked back at him with those intelligent, patient eyes. "I suppose we're in this together now," Elias said quietly. "For better or worse." The decision was made. Tomorrow he'd head back to his homestead with the donkey. He'd spend a few days letting the animal recover, building up his strength. And then he'd do what prospectors had been doing in these mountains for decades. He'd follow the signs, he'd trust his instincts, he'd see where the trail led. What he didn't know, couldn't know, was that his decision had already been noticed by eyes less friendly than Tom Hadley's. That word of the fool drift rider, who'd paid a whole $1 for a diseased donkey, was spreading through Copper Ridge. That some men with sharp minds and sharper instincts for opportunity, were already wondering why anyone would make such a purchase. And that the simple act of buying a donkey at auction had just set in motion a chain of events that would test everything Elias Crane thought he knew about himself, about trust, and about what a man was willing to risk for a chance at something better. He led the donkey out of the pen as evening approached, heading for the general store to purchase feed before the long ride home. Behind them, the sun dipped toward the mountains, casting long shadows across Copper Ridge. The shadows stretched and merged, and in them moved the outlines of men whose interest in Elias and his donkey had nothing to do with charity or concern for animal welfare. The hunt had begun, though Elias didn't know it yet. And the thing about being hunted is that by the time you realize it, you're already deeper into the chase than you ever meant to go. The ride back to Elias's homestead took most of the day. He'd rigged a lead rope for the donkey, who followed his horse with surprising willingness despite the limp. They traveled north along the stage road for 15 miles before turning onto the network of smaller trails that wound through the foothills. By late afternoon, they reached the property Elias had claimed and worked for the past 7 years. It wasn't much to look at. A single-room cabin built from lodgepole pine, a small barn that leaned slightly to the east, a chicken coop, and a corral that enclosed maybe half an acre. Beyond the immediate homestead, his grazing land stretched across a shallow valley, decent grass in summer, sparse in winter, enough to support the 20 head of cattle that represented the sum total of his wealth. Elias settled the donkey in the barn with fresh water and the alfalfa Tom had given him. The animal ate with enthusiasm, suggesting he'd been hungry for some time. While the donkey ate, Elias examined him more thoroughly, cleaning away more of the resin, checking his hooves, treating the strained leg with a poultice of herbs his mother had taught him to make decades ago. "You need a name," Elias said, running a brush through the areas of clean coat. "Can't just keep calling you the donkey." The animal's ears swiveled toward him, attentive. "How about Solomon? You've got a wise look about you, and you're certainly carrying a fortune, even if nobody but me knows it yet." Solomon, for that's what he would be called from now on, seemed to accept this designation with equanimity. He finished his meal and settled onto the straw bedding with a deep sigh that spoke of exhaustion and relief in equal measure. Elias left him to rest and walked back to the cabin as twilight gathered. He lit a lamp, stoked the fire in the small iron stove, and prepared a simple meal of beans and salt pork. While he ate, he studied the map he'd tacked to the cabin wall years ago, a survey map of the territory showing the major geographical features and the few established roads. The Whitaker Ranch sat approximately 30 miles northeast of his homestead, pressed against the Bitterroot Range. Between his land and theirs lay a patchwork of claims, homesteads, and vast stretches of unclaimed wilderness. The mountains themselves rose to over 9,000 feet in places, cut through with canyons and creeks, dense with lodgepole pine and Douglas fir. Finding one specific seep or spring in all that country would be like finding a specific grain of sand on a beach, unless you had a guide who knew exactly where to go. That was Solomon's value, beyond the gold he currently wore. Once the donkey recovered his strength, Elias could simply let him loose and follow. Animals had an uncanny ability to find their way home, to return to familiar territory. Solomon had been wandering for weeks before the Whitakers found him, but his instincts would still remember the place he considered home, the place where he'd rolled in that golden mud. The plan was simple, but simple plans had a way of becoming complicated. A knock on the cabin door came just after full dark. Elias set down his coffee cup slowly, his mind running through the possibilities. Visitors were rare this far out, especially after nightfall. He reached for the rifle that hung above the door, an old Henry repeater that had seen better days, but still shot true, and held it loosely as he opened the door. 2 men stood in the doorway, their faces shadowed by hat brims and the darkness beyond the lamplight. The taller of the 2 spoke first. "Evening. You'd be Elias Crane?" "I am, and you are." "Name's Reed Holloway. This is my associate, Frank Chen. We apologize for the late hour, but we've ridden a fair distance and hoped we might have a word with you." Reed Holloway was in his mid-30s, dressed well for a man traveling through rough country, wool coat, clean shirt, polished boots. His face had a lean, intelligent cast to it, with eyes that missed very little. Frank Chen was shorter, stockier, with the quiet watchfulness of someone who'd learned to observe before acting. Both men wore gun belts, though neither had their hands near their weapons. "A word about what?" Elias kept his tone neutral, the rifle still in hand. "About the donkey you purchased today at the Copper Ridge auction. We were there, saw the whole thing." Elias felt his stomach tighten, but he kept his expression carefully blank. "That so?" "It is." Reed smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Now, most folks thought you were crazy, paying a whole $1 for that diseased animal. But Frank and I, we got to thinking. Elias Crane's got a reputation as a man who knows livestock, knows horses, knows cattle, knows mules. So we asked ourselves, why would a man like that buy a donkey that everyone else thought was dying? Maybe I felt sorry for it." "Maybe," Reed agreed. "Or maybe you saw something everyone else missed." The silence stretched between them. Elias could hear his own heartbeat, steady and loud in his ears. These weren't casual visitors. These were men who'd tracked him down for a specific purpose, and that purpose had nothing to do with concern for animal welfare. Frank Chen spoke for the first time, his voice quiet but carrying an edge. "We followed you from Copper Ridge, watched you clean that donkey up at the livery, watched you pick at those crusty patches. You found something, didn't you?" There was no point in denying it. These men hadn't ridden all this way on speculation alone. "I found pine resin," Elias said carefully. "Nothing more than that." "Pine resin," Reed nodded slowly. "Just pine resin, and that's why you spent an hour examining a worthless animal. That's why you're all the way out here, instead of selling him for parts." "I don't sell animals for parts." "No, you don't. You're an honest man, Mr. Crane. Everyone in Copper Ridge will tell you that. Elias Crane pays his debts, keeps his word, minds his own business." Reed took a step closer. "But you're also a poor man, and poor men sometimes make decisions they wouldn't otherwise make when opportunity comes knocking. What do you want?" "Partnership." Reed said it simply, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "You've got that donkey. You've got whatever knowledge or suspicion that made you buy him. Frank and I, we've got resources, money, equipment, men who can work a claim. We've got connections with people who can help us stake legal claims, handle the paperwork, deal with any complications that might arise. I'm not interested in partnership. Not even for a fair split? Say, 1/3 to you, 2/3 to us? That's generous, considering we could have just followed that donkey ourselves without your permission." Elias's grip on the rifle tightened. "This is my land, that's my animal. I don't recall inviting you here, and I sure as hell don't recall agreeing to any partnership." Frank Chen's hand drifted closer to his gun belt, not threatening, just positioning. Reed held up a placating hand. "Easy, Mr. Crane. We're not here to make trouble, just making a business proposition. You take some time. Think it over. We're staying at the Copper Ridge Hotel for the next week. You change your mind, you know where to find us." He touched his hat brim. "We'll show ourselves out." The two men turned and walked into the darkness. Elias stood in the doorway, listening to their horses depart, not moving until the sound of hoofbeats faded completely. Then he closed the door, dropped the crossbar into place, and leaned the rifle against the wall. His hands were shaking. Not from fear, though, there'd been a thread of that, but from anger and something close to despair. He'd had the donkey for less than a day, and already men were circling. Already the complications were beginning. He walked to the window and looked out toward the barn. Solomon was in there, resting, recovering, unknowingly carrying the secret that would either save Elias or destroy him. And now that secret was no longer his alone. Reed Holloway and Frank Chen knew something was happening. They didn't know exactly what not yet, but they were smart enough and patient enough to wait and watch. Elias had thought he could do this quietly, carefully, without drawing attention. But attention had found him anyway, and he'd been naive to think otherwise. In country like this, nothing stayed secret for long, especially not gold. He'd need to move faster than planned. Tomorrow, as soon as Solomon was strong enough, they'd have to leave. He'd take supplies for a week, maybe 2. He'd head into the mountains and trust the donkey to lead him to the source. And he'd have to accept that when he came back, if he came back, his life would never be simple again. Elias spent a restless night weighing his options, and by dawn he'd reached a decision. He couldn't wait for Solomon to fully recover. Every day he delayed was another day for Reed Holloway and Frank Chen, or others like them, to make their moves. If word spread about the donkey, if more people started asking questions, the situation would spiral beyond his control. He rose before first light and began assembling supplies: dried beans, salt pork, coffee, flour for making trail bread, 2 canteens for water, his bedroll, a tarp for shelter, ammunition for the Henry rifle and for the old Colt revolver he'd carried since his 20s, a coil of rope, basic tools, a hammer, a small pickaxe, a gold pan folded flat, medical supplies, including more of the herb poultice for Solomon's leg. The preparations took most of the morning. By midday, he'd loaded everything onto his horse, a steady grey gelding named Tucker, who'd been with him for 5 years. Solomon watched these activities from the barn with alert interest, eating the alfalfa and gaining strength with every hour. Elias was testing the balance of his pack when he heard a wagon approaching. He tensed, reaching for the rifle, then relaxed when he recognized the vehicle. It was Tom Hadley's buckboard, and Tom himself sat in the driver's seat. But Tom wasn't alone. Beside him sat a woman Elias hadn't seen in nearly 3 years, Sarah Brennan. She was 50 years old, with steel-grey hair pulled back in a practical bun, and eyes the color of amber. She wore a simple traveling dress and a shawl against the autumn chill. She'd been married to Jack Brennan, a rancher whose land bordered Elias's property to the west. Jack had died 2 winters ago, thrown from a horse and breaking his neck. Sarah had sold most of the ranch, but kept a small parcel and a house where she now lived alone, taking in sewing and occasionally helping with difficult births, human or animal, when her skills were needed. Tom pulled the wagon to a stop and climbed down. Sarah followed, moving with the easy competence of someone comfortable in rough country. "Elias," Tom said, "got a visitor for you." "Sarah," Elias nodded to her. "It's been a while." "Too long," she agreed. "I heard about your auction purchase. Tom's been telling me the story all morning." "That's him. May I see him?" Elias hesitated, glancing at Tom, who gave a small shrug that said he'd tried to talk Sarah out of coming but had failed. That was Sarah once she decided something needed doing. There was no dissuading her. "Of course," Elias said. They walked to the barn together. Solomon stood in his stall, looking considerably better than he had 24 hours ago. The good feed and rest had already begun to restore his strength. Sarah approached slowly, extending her hand for the donkey to smell, then gently examining the remaining patches of resin. "Tom told me you think this is pine resin mixed with something else," she said quietly. Elias shot Tom a sharp look. His old friend held up his hands defensively. "I didn't tell her what you found, just that you'd mentioned resin. But Sarah's no fool, Elias. She spent her whole life in these mountains. She knows things." Sarah continued her examination, her fingers moving with practiced sureness across Solomon's coat. Finally, she straightened and met Elias's eyes. "Gold," she said simply. "That's what this is about. Gold in the resin." There was no point denying it. Elias nodded. "I thought so." Sarah's expression was thoughtful rather than greedy. "Jack and we used to talk about the old legends, stories about lost veins in the high country, places where gold ran so pure you could pick it out of the stream beds with your bare hands. Most of it was nonsense prospector talk, wish fulfillment. But sometimes legends have roots in truth." "Sarah," Elias began. She held up a hand. "I'm not here to claim a share or demand a partnership. My late husband left me comfortable enough, and I've never been one for chasing wealth anyway. But I am here to tell you that you're about to do something dangerous, and you're not prepared for it. I've been in the mountains before." "You've been in the mountains, yes, but you've never been in them while carrying a secret that could make you rich or get you killed. That changes everything." She gestured toward his assembled supplies. "You're planning to leave soon. Tomorrow, I'd guess. Or maybe even today. Word travels fast. 2 men came through town asking questions about you, Reed Holloway and Frank Chen. They didn't get much information. People around here are loyal to their own, but they're not the only ones interested. There are others. Men I don't know. Men who've been watching the trails, asking about property up near the Whitaker's place. Elias felt cold, despite the afternoon warmth. How many others? 3 that I've heard about. Maybe more. Sarah's expression was grave. Elias, gold fever spreads faster than any disease. By now, half of Copper Ridge suspects something's happening. They don't know what exactly, but they know a man who understands livestock bought a donkey nobody else wanted, and they're smart enough to wonder why. Tom spoke up. I told her you'd likely refuse help, but I also told her you'd be foolish to refuse, given the circumstances. Help with what? Sarah moved to stand directly in front of Elias, her gaze steady and unwavering. I'm coming with you, into the mountains, to help you find whatever this donkey leads you to. Absolutely not. Why not? Because it's dangerous. Because I won't be responsible for putting you at risk. Because I'm a woman? Sarah's tone sharpened. I lived in these mountains before you were born, Elias Crane. I can shoot as well as most men, and better than some. I know how to track, how to survive, how to read weather and terrain. And more importantly, I know how to handle people, which is a skill you're going to need more than marksmanship or mountain craft. Sarah. Jack's been gone 2 years, she continued, her voice softening slightly. 2 years of living alone in that house, taking in sewing, making do. I loved my husband, and I honor his memory. But I'm not dead yet, and I'm not content to spend whatever years I have left just existing. This, she gestured toward Solomon, this is an adventure, maybe the last one I'll have, and I'll be damned if I let you tell me I can't be part of it. Elias looked at Tom, hoping for support, but his friend just shrugged again. She's right about being useful, Elias, and she's right about you needing help. You can't watch Solomon and watch your back at the same time, not with men like Holloway sniffing around. 2 people are easier to spot than 1, Elias argued. 2 people can keep watch while the other sleeps, Sarah countered. 2 people can defend a camp if it comes to that, and 2 people can corroborate a claim if you find the source. She paused. Also, I have something you need. She reached into her shawl and pulled out a leather-bound book, its pages yellowed with age. This was Jack's. Before he became a rancher, he spent 5 years prospecting in these mountains. He kept detailed notes, locations, geological formations, water sources, everything. There are references in here to places where gold sign appeared, places he meant to return to but never did. If we're lucky, one of those places might match where your donkey came from. Elias took the book, opened it, and saw page after page of careful handwriting, sketches of mountain peaks and stream configurations, notes about mineral deposits and promising formations. It was a treasure map of its own kind, not leading to gold directly, but providing the knowledge that could make finding it possible. I can't pay you, he said quietly. If we find nothing, you'll have wasted your time. If we find nothing, I'll have had an adventure and spent time with a friend instead of sitting alone in an empty house. That's payment enough, Sarah smiled. Besides, if we do find something, I trust you to be fair about it. You're not a greedy man, Elias. That's why I'm willing to help you. Tom cleared his throat. For what it's worth, I think she's right. About all of it, you need someone you can trust. And Sarah's one of the few people in this territory who fits that description. Elias looked at the 3 of them, Tom standing by his wagon, Sarah with her late husband's prospecting journal, Solomon watching from his stall with those knowing eyes. His first instinct was still to refuse, to insist on going alone, but his instincts had also told him he could keep the donkey's secret, and that had proven naively optimistic. If you're coming, he said finally, we leave before dawn tomorrow, we travel light, and we move fast. And if things get dangerous, if men like Holloway catch up to us, you follow my lead without question. Agreed? Sarah extended her hand. Agreed. They shook on it, and just like that, Elias's solitary journey became a partnership. He wasn't sure if that made him feel better or worse about what lay ahead. But as Tom drove away and Sarah began helping him refine his supply list, Elias found himself thinking that maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to face everything alone. Sometimes the strongest thing a man could do was accept help when it was offered, even if every instinct told him to protect others by keeping them at a distance, even if accepting help meant admitting he needed it. The sun moved across the sky, and the shadows lengthened, and tomorrow came closer with every passing moment. They left the homestead 2 hours before dawn, while stars still burned cold and bright overhead. Elias rode Tucker. Sarah rode a sturdy mare named Bess that she'd brought with her the evening before, and Solomon walked between them on a long lead rope. The donkey's limp had improved significantly, though Elias still moved at a careful pace to avoid straining the healing leg. They headed northeast, following game trails and old prospector paths that wound through the foothills. The Bitterroot Mountains rose before them like dark monuments against the slowly lightening sky. Somewhere in those peaks lay the answer to Solomon's secret. Somewhere up there was the place where a donkey had rolled in fortune. For the first few hours they rode in comfortable silence. Sarah had the good sense not to fill the quiet with unnecessary conversation, and Elias appreciated that. The morning revealed itself in stages, first the eastern sky turning pale, then gold, then the sun itself cresting the horizon and spilling light across the landscape. By mid-morning they'd climbed high enough that the air carried a sharper bite. Pine forests closed in around them, dense and aromatic. Solomon seemed more alert now, his ears pricking forward frequently, his head turning to examine the terrain. Occasionally he'd pause and test the air, as if searching for familiar scents. "He knows this country," Sarah observed. "Look at the way he moves. He's not just following us, he's recognizing landmarks." She was right. The donkey's demeanor had changed subtly since they'd entered the higher elevation. There was purpose in his movements now, direction beyond simply being led. Around noon, they stopped to rest the animals and eat a cold meal of salt pork and hard bread. While Sarah tended to the horses, Elias studied Jack Brennan's prospecting journal. The entries dated back 15 years, chronicling expeditions into various sections of the Bitterroots. Jack had been thorough, noting everything from rock formations to vegetation patterns, water sources to animal trails. One entry caught Elias's attention. It was dated July 1874, and Jack had written about a box canyon in the high country, approximately 40 miles northeast of what would become his ranch. He'd found quartz formations there, signs of mineralization, and what he called a peculiar seep, where the water ran through exposed pine roots and emerged tinted with color. He'd planned to return with proper equipment, but had met Sarah that autumn, married her in the spring, and apparently never made it back to that canyon. "Find something?" Sarah appeared beside him, looking over his shoulder at the journal. "Maybe. Your husband mentions a seep with colored water. That could be a place where gold is exposed to surface drainage." "Let me see." Sarah took the journal and read the entry carefully. Her expression grew thoughtful. "I remember him talking about that trip. He came back excited, but wouldn't tell me exactly what he'd found. Said he wanted to be certain before he got my hopes up." She touched the page gently. "He never did go back. Life got in the way. Building the ranch, raising cattle, all the daily work that fills up your years until you look back and wonder where the time went. Do you think we can find it? This canyon? If Solomon leads us in the right direction, yes. Jack's notes are detailed enough to recognize the landmarks." She handed the journal back. "But Elias, you should know we're being followed." Elias's hand went instinctively to his rifle. "How long?" "I noticed riders on our back trail about an hour ago. 2 of them, keeping their distance. They're good at it, staying just out of clear sight, using the terrain. If I hadn't been watching specifically for pursuit, I might have missed them." "Holloway and Chen?" "Can't say for certain. but I'd wager on it." Elias swore softly. He'd hoped for at least 2 or 3 days before anyone picked up their trail, but of course men like Holloway wouldn't leave things to chance. They'd have been watching his homestead, waiting for exactly this kind of departure. "What do you want to do?" Sarah asked. "Keep going. We're committed now. And maybe," he glanced at Solomon, "maybe our friend here will lead us somewhere they can't easily follow." They mounted up and continued northeast, climbing steadily. The terrain grew more rugged, the trails more narrow and precarious. They crossed several streams, their waters cold and clear, rushing down from the high peaks. Each time they encountered water, Solomon would pause and sniff, testing, but then moving on. Whatever he was searching for, he hadn't found it yet. As afternoon stretched toward evening, clouds began building over the peaks. Sarah studied them with a practiced eye. "Weather's turning. We might have rain tonight, maybe snow if we're high enough. We need to find shelter. There's an old trapper's cabin marked in Jack's journal, about 3 miles ahead if I'm reading the landmarks right. It might still be standing." They found it just as the first drops of rain began to fall. The cabin was more of a shack, really 4 walls of weathered logs, a roof with more holes than planks, and a floor that had mostly returned to dirt. But it had a stone fireplace that was still intact and 3 walls that would block the worst of the wind. More importantly, there was a small lean-to attached that would shelter the animals. They unsaddled quickly, getting horses and donkey under cover before the rain intensified. Then they retreated to the cabin, where Elias worked to get a fire started, while Sarah examined their surroundings with a critical eye. "Someone's been here recently," she said, pointing to a small pile of wood stacked near the fireplace. "That's not old woodcutter's leavings. That's been gathered within the past few weeks." Elias felt the wood. It was dry beneath the dust, seasoned but not rotten. "Hunters, maybe, or prospectors. Or our friends on the back trail, scouting ahead." Sarah moved to the single window, what remained of it, and looked out at the darkening forest. "They'll have to stop too in this weather. Gives us a few hours at least." The fire caught and grew, casting warm light and precious heat. They ate a more substantial meal, beans heated in a tin pot, coffee strong enough to chase away the evening chill. Outside, rain hammered against the cabin's roof, finding its way through gaps and creating small streams across the dirt floor. "I've been thinking," Sarah said as they ate, "about what happens if we actually find this gold deposit, about what comes after. One step at a time. That's what men always say when they don't want to face difficult questions." Her tone was gentle but firm. "Elias, if there's real wealth up here, it's going to change everything. You know that, don't you?" "I know. Filing a claim, defending it, working it, that takes resources, time, legal knowledge, and it attracts attention. Men like Holloway are just the beginning. If word gets out about a major strike, this whole territory will flood with prospectors and claim jumpers and people willing to do violence for a share of the wealth." Elias poked at the fire, watching sparks rise and die. "I've thought about that. All of it. But Sarah, I'm 53 years old. I've worked hard my whole life and have almost nothing to show for it. This might be my only chance at something better. Maybe that makes me foolish or greedy, but I can't walk away from it, not without at least seeing it through." "I'm not asking you to walk away. I'm asking you to be realistic about what you're walking toward." Before Elias could respond, Solomon made a noise in the lean-to, a low, anxious bray that cut through the sound of rain. Both humans were on their feet instantly, Elias grabbing his rifle. They moved to the lean-to entrance. Solomon stood alert, ears forward, staring into the rain-soaked darkness. Tucker and Bess were restless too, shifting their weight and snorting. "Something's out there," Sarah whispered. Elias peered into the storm, but could see nothing beyond a few yards. The rain created a curtain of movement and sound that made it impossible to distinguish threats from shadows. But Solomon's behavior was clear. The donkey had detected something, someone approaching through the weather. "Get back to the cabin," Elias said quietly. "Bank the fire so it doesn't show as much. I'll keep watch here. You can't see anything in this rain." Maybe not. But whatever's out there can't see us clearly either. And if they're coming tonight, they'll be cold and wet and less effective than they would be tomorrow. He checked his rifle, making sure the rounds were seated properly. Go on. I'll call if I need you. Sarah hesitated, then retreated to the cabin. Elias positioned himself in the lean-to entrance, sheltered from the worst of the rain, but able to watch the approaches. Solomon stood beside him, solid and alert, their shoulders almost touching. Minutes passed. Then an hour. The rain never slackened, and whatever Solomon had sensed never materialized into visible threat. But Elias knew better than to dismiss the donkey's instincts. Something had been out there. Something was still out there, watching and waiting. And tomorrow, in daylight, they'd have to move forward into country that was growing more dangerous with every mile they traveled. Dawn came grey and cold. The rain had stopped some time before first light, leaving the forest dripping and the air thick with mist. Elias hadn't slept, maintaining his watch through the long hours. His eyes felt gritty, his body stiff from standing in the cold, but his mind remained alert. Sarah emerged from the cabin as pale light filtered through the clouds. She took one look at him and shook her head. "You should have woken me for a shift. Nothing to wake you for. Whatever spooked Solomon never showed itself. Or they were smart enough to wait for better conditions." She studied the tree line, her expression thoughtful. "We can't keep traveling if you're exhausted. One mistake up here could be fatal. I'll manage." Men always say that, right up until they fall off a cliff or walk into a bear. She moved past him to check on the animals. All three seemed calm now. The night's tension dissipated with the coming of day. "We'll move out after a hot meal and coffee. You need food and warmth before we go higher." Elias wanted to argue, but recognized the wisdom in her words. They built up the fire and made a proper breakfast: beans and salt pork fried in a pan, coffee boiled strong. The hot food helped clear the fog from Elias's mind, though exhaustion still pulled at the edges of his awareness. While they ate, Sarah consulted Jack's journal. "According to these notes, we're about 20 miles from that box canyon," he described. "The terrain gets rougher from here, steeper climbs, fewer trails. We'll need to let Solomon lead more directly instead of trying to follow established paths." "He's been getting more purposeful," Elias observed. "Yesterday afternoon, I noticed him pulling toward the northeast, even when the trail went east. He knows where he's going." They broke camp efficiently, loading their gear and preparing the animals. Before mounting, Elias walked a perimeter around the cabin, reading the ground the way his father had taught him years ago. The rain had washed away most tracks, but not all. In one sheltered spot beneath an overhang, he found the clear impression of a boot heel, a large boot, worn down on the outside edge, pressed into soft earth. Someone had been watching the cabin during the night, had stood in that exact spot for long enough to leave a deep impression, had watched them through the storm and then retreated before dawn. He showed Sarah the track. She studied it silently, then met his eyes. "Still think we should keep going?" "More than ever. If they're this close, stopping won't help. Our best chance is to reach the canyon, find what we're looking for, and get out before they can organize something more aggressive than surveillance. And if there's nothing there, if this whole journey is based on a wrong guess, then we'll have wasted time and effort, but at least we'll know." They rode out, releasing Solomon from his lead rope and letting him choose the path. The donkey moved with increasing confidence, navigating through dense timber and across rocky slopes that would have been treacherous for someone unfamiliar with the country. Several times they had to dismount and lead the horses across particularly difficult sections, trusting Solomon's judgment about the safest routes. The morning warmed slightly as they climbed, though the sun never fully broke through the cloud cover. They followed ridgelines when possible, avoiding the valley bottoms where visibility was poor and ambush too easy. Elias's exhaustion was becoming harder to ignore, but he pushed through it, focusing on the immediate tasks, watching the trail, monitoring their back trail, checking on Sarah and the animals. Around midday, Solomon led them to a stream wider and faster than others they'd crossed, its water carrying a slight discoloration that Elias recognized immediately. The mineral content was high here, leaching from exposed rock upstream. This was promising country for prospecting. The donkey waded into the stream without hesitation, stopping in the middle where the water ran just below his belly. He drank deeply, then stood there, perfectly still, as if listening to something only he could hear. "He's close," Sarah said softly. "Look at him. He's home." She was right. Everything about Solomon's posture had changed. The alert wariness of the past 2 days had given way to relaxed familiarity. This was his country, his territory, and somewhere nearby was the place he'd been instinctively navigating toward since they'd left Elias's homestead. They followed the stream upward, climbing steadily. The forest thinned, giving way to more open terrain, alpine meadows, scattered stands of pine, exposed rock faces that showed the bones of the mountains. The stream's source was somewhere above them, in the high country, where snow lingered year-round in sheltered pockets. Then Solomon stopped. Simply stopped, in the middle of a meadow, his head raised and ears forward. He brayed once a sound of recognition and perhaps triumph, and began moving again, this time at a trot, despite his healing leg. "Stay close," Elias told Sarah, as they urged their horses forward. Solomon led them around a rocky outcrop and through a narrow gap between 2 massive boulders. Beyond lay exactly what Jack Brennan's journal had described, a box canyon, its walls rising steeply on 3 sides, its floor covered in grass and wildflowers that had somehow survived the approaching winter. A small stream emerged from the back wall, flowing through what looked like exposed tree roots before gathering in a natural basin. But it was the quality of the water that made Elias's breath catch. Where the stream emerged, it ran clear. But as it passed through those exposed roots and over certain rock formations, it took on a distinct golden tint, not from sediment, but from particles suspended in the water itself. Solomon walked directly to the stream's source, to the place where water emerged from rock and roots, and without hesitation began rolling in the mud, in the water, coating himself with the same resinous material that had covered him when Elias first saw him at the auction. Sarah dismounted and approached the water's edge. She knelt, cupped her hands, and brought up a sample of the sediment from the basin. Even from several feet away, Elias could see the gold flakes glinting in her palm, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, each one tiny but unmistakable. "My God," she whispered. "Jack was right. It's all here." Elias climbed down from Tucker, his exhaustion forgotten. He moved to the exposed roots, examining them carefully. The tree, a massive ponderosa pine, had its roots partially exposed by erosion, and those roots had grown through a gold-bearing quartz vein. As water from the spring flowed through the roots, it picked up both dissolved pine resin and gold particles, depositing them wherever the water slowed or pooled. But that wasn't the most remarkable part. Following the exposed roots back, Elias found where they entered solid rock, and that rock showed a vein of white quartz shot through with gold. Not tiny traces or occasional flecks, but substantial ribbons of pure metal running through the stone. "Sarah," he called, "you need to see this." She came to stand beside him, and for a long moment neither spoke. They were looking at wealth beyond reasonable estimation, the kind of find that prospectors searched for their entire lives, the kind of strike that could change everything. "What do we do now?" Sarah finally asked. Before Elias could answer, a voice carried across the meadow. "I'd say you drop your weapons and step away from that rock face." Nice and slow. They turned. Reed Holloway stood at the canyon's entrance, Frank Chen beside him, both men with rifles leveled and ready. And behind them, stepping into view with cruel smiles, were 3 other men Elias had never seen before. They'd been found, and they were trapped in a box canyon with no way out. Elias's hand moved toward his rifle, but Sarah's voice stopped him. "Don't." She spoke quietly, but there was something in her tone, a quality he couldn't quite identify. Not fear, exactly, something else. Reed Holloway smiled as he advanced into the canyon, his rifle steady. "Smart woman, Mr. Crane. I'd appreciate it if you'd unbuckle that gun belt and set it down along with the rifle. Frank, keep them covered while I—" "Reed Holloway," Sarah interrupted, still speaking in that strange, measured tone, "also known as Reed Harrison, formerly of the Colorado Territorial Mining Commission, fired 3 years ago for accepting bribes to falsify claim reports." Holloway's smile faltered. Frank Chen's rifle wavered slightly. The 3 men behind them looked confused. Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger. "And Frank Chen, real name Franklin Chen Wei, son of a Chinese immigrant who owned a successful dry goods store in Denver until Reed here forced him into bankruptcy through fraudulent debt claims. Frank's been tracking Reed ever since, waiting for a chance to bring him to justice." Elias stared at Sarah, completely lost. She wasn't looking at him, though. Her attention was fixed on Holloway and Chen, and there was something in her stance, a professional assessment, a calculation that he'd never seen before. Holloway's smile disappeared entirely. "Who the hell are you?" Sarah reached slowly into her coat and pulled out a leather wallet, flipping it open to reveal a badge. "Sarah Brennan, United States Deputy Marshal, appointed by Judge Marcus Wheeler of the Colorado District Court. I've been investigating claims of illegal mining operations and fraud in the Montana Territory for the past 18 months. The words hung in the air like gun smoke. Elias felt his entire understanding of the past 3 days collapse and reassemble into a completely different shape. Frank Chen lowered his rifle. "Marshal Brennan, I've heard of you. And I've heard of you, Mr. Chen. Your father's case was brought to our attention 6 months ago. We've been building a case against Mr. Holloway here, gathering evidence of his various schemes and frauds across 3 territories. She gestured toward the canyon. "This is just his latest attempt. He's been following reports of gold strikes, getting to them before legitimate prospectors can file proper claims, and using violence and intimidation to secure the deposits for himself." Holloway's face had gone hard. "You have no jurisdiction here. Federal marshals have jurisdiction anywhere in U.S. territories. You know that." "Reed," Sarah's voice was ice, "but you're right that I've been operating outside normal procedures. Judge Wheeler authorized a covert investigation because you have connections, corrupt officials who warn you when law enforcement is coming. The only way to catch you was to become someone you wouldn't see as a threat. A widow," Holloway spat, taking in sewing, playing the helpless woman. "Exactly what you'd expect, exactly what you'd dismiss." Sarah glanced at Elias for the first time, and he saw something like apology in her eyes. "I'm sorry, Elias. I wasn't using you, not intentionally. But when I heard about your donkey purchase, when Tom told me you'd found something significant, I realized this was my chance. I knew Holloway would follow you. Knew he couldn't resist the possibility of another strike to steal. I just needed to get close enough to witness him committing a federal crime." "Which would be what, exactly?" Holloway demanded. "Following someone? Being in a canyon? You've got nothing, Marshal. I have you threatening armed violence to secure a mining claim that isn't yours. I have your admission of intent to take this strike by force. And most importantly," she smiled coldly, "I have Frank Chen here as a witness to everything you've done, including your threats to his family if he didn't help you with this scheme." Chen nodded slowly. "She approached me 2 weeks ago, told me she could get my father justice if I cooperated. I've been documenting everything, every order you gave, every threat you made. It's all written down, Reed, all of it." The 3 men behind Holloway began backing away. They were hired muscle, nothing more, and smart enough to know when a situation had turned poisonous. Within seconds, they disappeared back through the canyon entrance, leaving Holloway alone with a rifle he was slowly realizing he couldn't use. "This is insane," Holloway said, but his voice had lost its confidence. "You're telling me this entire thing was a setup?" "Not the gold," Sarah corrected. "That's real. Solomon's story is real. But yes, I used this situation to draw you out, to make you show your hand in front of witnesses. And now, she drew a revolver from beneath her coat with practiced ease. You're going to drop that rifle and put your hands where I can see them. For a long moment, Holloway didn't move. Elias could see the calculation happening behind his eyes, weighing odds, considering options. But Chen raised his rifle again, this time aimed at Holloway, and that decided it. The rifle clattered to the ground. "Smart choice," Sarah said. She looked at Elias. "Would you mind securing his weapon?" Elias moved forward mechanically, his mind still reeling. He picked up Holloway's rifle, checked it, and then stood there feeling like a stranger in his own life. Everything he'd thought he understood Sarah's motivations, her reasons for joining him. Her very identity had been revealed as something entirely different. Sarah kept her revolver trained on Holloway while addressing Chen. "Frank, there's a territorial marshal station about 40 miles south of here. You know the way?" "I do." "Take Mr. Holloway there. I'll follow in 2 days with full documentation of his crimes. Tell Marshal Garrett that Deputy Marshal Brennan sends her regards and that Judge Wheeler will be forwarding official charges within the week." Chen zip-tied Holloway's hands with practiced efficiency. Apparently he'd come prepared for this outcome, and led him toward the canyon entrance. Holloway shot one last look at the gold-bearing vein, a look of such raw frustration and greed that it made Elias's skin crawl. Then both men were gone, leaving only Elias and Sarah in the canyon with Solomon and the horses. Sarah holstered her revolver and turned to face Elias fully. "I know you have questions." "Questions." Elias heard his own voice come out flat, empty. "That's one word for it. I should have told you the truth from the beginning, but I couldn't risk it. If Holloway had suspected I was anything other than a lonely widow, he would have disappeared, and we'd have lost our chance to bring him in." She took a step closer. "But I want you to understand something, Elias. Everything I said about wanting an adventure, about not wanting to spend the rest of my life just existing, that was true. The badge doesn't define who I am. It's just what I do. Your husband, Jack, was that real?" Pain crossed her face, genuine and deep. "Yes, everything about Jack was real. He was a prospector before he was a rancher, exactly as I said. This," she touched the journal in her coat, "this is really his. I've been carrying it for 2 years, and every word I told you about him was true. The only thing I didn't tell you was what I became after he died. A federal marshal. Judge Wheeler recruited me personally. Said I had skills that were being wasted on sewing and midwifery. Said the territory needed people who could move through society without drawing attention, who could investigate crimes that conventional marshals couldn't touch." She met his eyes. "I said yes, because I needed something to live for after Jack died, because I needed to matter again." Elias walked to the edge of the stream, looking down at the gold-tinted water. Everything Elias had thought he was doing, finding gold to secure his future, protecting himself from men like Holloway, had been part of someone else's plan. He'd been a piece on a board he hadn't known existed. "What happens now?" he asked quietly. "Now," Sarah came to stand beside him, "now we file a proper claim on this canyon. In your name, Elias. This is your discovery, your donkey, your fortune. I have no legal claim to it, and I'm not asking for one. You could take it. You're a federal marshal. You could say this is government land or evidence, or I could do a lot of things, but I won't." She touched his arm gently. "You're a good man, Elias Crane. You saw a suffering animal and helped it when everyone else laughed. You found something valuable, and your first instinct wasn't to exploit it, but to be careful and thoughtful. You deserve whatever wealth this canyon brings you." Elias turned to look at her, really look at her. The woman standing beside him was both the Sarah he'd known and someone completely different, a widow who'd lost her husband, a marshal hunting criminals, a person who'd chosen to live multiple truths simultaneously because the world required it. "I don't know how to feel about any of this," he admitted. "That's fair. I'd be more worried if you just accepted it without question." She smiled slightly. If it helps, I really do consider you a friend. The person you've been traveling with, that's who I actually am. Underneath the badge. A woman who wanted an adventure and maybe wanted to help someone decent find something good in this difficult world. Elias looked back at the canyon, at the gold visible in the exposed quartz, at Solomon rolling in mud that would make them both wealthy beyond measure. He thought about the past 3 days, about the fear and excitement and exhaustion, about how nothing was ever quite as simple as it first appeared. "Stay," he said finally. "Help me file the claim properly. Make sure everything's legal and documented. And when this canyon starts producing, when the wealth starts flowing, take a share. A full third, same as I would have offered any genuine partner." "Elias, I mean it, Sarah. Marshal or not, you've been honest where it mattered. And maybe I need someone around who understands how complicated this world can be." He extended his hand. "Partners?" She looked at his hand for a long moment, then clasped it firmly. "Partners." And there, in a box canyon in the Montana Territory, with a donkey covered in gold-bearing mud and a fortune waiting to be claimed, 2 people who'd both been carrying secrets began the harder work of building something honest. They spent the remainder of that day documenting everything. Sarah, with her marshal's training, was methodical about it. She sketched the canyon from multiple angles, noting landmarks and measurements. She took samples of the gold-bearing quartz and carefully wrapped them in cloth. She wrote detailed descriptions of the water flow, the exposed roots, the geological formations. Elias worked alongside her, but his mind kept drifting. Not to the gold, though that was significant enough, but to the strange sense of displacement he felt. For 3 days, he'd believed he was the one making decisions, choosing his path, protecting his discovery. Now he understood he'd been part of something larger, a piece in Sarah's investigation of Reed Holloway. The knowledge sat uncomfortably, like a shirt that didn't quite fit. As sunset approached, they made camp on a flat section of the canyon floor, far enough from the stream to stay dry, but close enough to access water. Solomon grazed contentedly, looking healthier than he had since Elias first saw him. The donkey's coat, where cleaned of resin, showed a pleasant grey colour. His limp had nearly disappeared. Whatever hardships he'd endured wandering from this canyon to the Whitaker Ranch, he'd survived them, and now he was home. Sarah prepared dinner while Elias gathered firewood. When they sat to eat, the conversation that had been postponed all afternoon finally began. "Tell me about the investigation," Elias said. "The whole thing from the start." Sarah was quiet for a moment, organizing her thoughts. "Judge Wheeler first approached me about 2 years ago, not long after Jack died. He'd known Jack slightly. They'd met when Jack was prospecting, before we were married. Wheeler had been tracking a pattern of fraudulent mining claims across Colorado and Montana territories. Someone was getting to promising strikes before the legitimate discoverers could file, using intimidation and violence to secure the claims. Holloway. Yes, but proving it was difficult. He had corrupt officials protecting him, warning him when law enforcement was coming. Witnesses disappeared or changed their stories. Physical evidence vanished. Wheeler needed someone who could investigate without being recognized as law enforcement. So he recruited a widow who nobody would suspect. He recruited someone who had prospecting knowledge, who understood mining law, who could move through frontier society without drawing attention. Sarah poked at the fire. "I won't pretend it was purely patriotic. I needed something, Elias. After Jack died, the ranch felt like a tomb. Every fence post, every barn beam, they all reminded me of what I'd lost. Taking Wheeler's badge gave me purpose again." "And you've been doing this for 18 months? Following Holloway's pattern, documenting his associates, building a case that would hold up in territorial court. But he was always one step ahead. Until 3 days ago, when Tom Hadley told me about a drift rider who'd bought a diseased donkey for $1. She smiled slightly. I knew immediately that Holloway would hear the same story. Knew he'd be too greedy to ignore the possibility of another strike. All I had to do was get close to you, and wait for him to show himself. You used me as bait. I gave you a choice. You could have refused my offer to come along. You chose to accept. She met his eyes. But yes, I knew Holloway would follow you, and I used that knowledge. I won't apologize for catching a criminal, but I am sorry that you were involved without knowing the full situation. Elias turned this over in his mind. She was right. She'd given him a choice, and he'd made it freely. But there was still something that bothered him about being a tool in someone else's plan, however justified that plan might have been. What if I'd said no to your partnership, he asked. What would you have done? Followed you anyway, at a distance, hoped Holloway would make his move somewhere I could witness it. She shrugged. It would have been harder, lonelier, and more dangerous. I'm glad you said yes. They sat in companionable silence as darkness settled over the canyon. Stars emerged overhead, brilliant and cold. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, the sound echoing off the canyon walls. Tomorrow, Sarah said. We need to ride to the nearest land office and file this claim. That's in Silver Creek, about 60 miles south. It'll take us 2 full days of hard riding. What about the canyon? Someone could find it while we're gone. Not likely. This place is remote enough that stumbling across it by accident would be near impossible, and everyone who knew we were heading this direction is either in custody or scared off. She paused. But you're right to be cautious. We should take samples with us enough to prove the value of the claim, but not so much that we're carrying obvious wealth. And then what? After we file? Then the hard work begins. Working a claim like this requires equipment, labor, expertise. You'll need to decide whether to work it yourself or sell shares to mining companies. You'll need legal representation to protect your interests. You'll need... She stopped, seeing his expression. What? I never wanted to be a mine owner, Sarah. I don't even know what I wanted. Security, maybe, a comfortable old age. Not wealth and complications and business dealings. Wealth is always complicated, but it's also opportunity. You can hire people to handle the details, Elias. You don't have to become someone you're not just because you found gold. He knew she was right, but the knowledge didn't ease the knot of anxiety in his chest. His whole life he'd valued simplicity, honest work, the satisfaction of a job done well. What he'd found in this canyon would change all of that, whether he wanted it to or not. The night deepened. They took turns keeping watch, though the likelihood of threats seemed minimal now. During his watch shift, Elias found himself studying the exposed quartz vein by moonlight, thinking about the strange sequence of events that had led him here. A donkey covered in resinous gold, a widow who was secretly a federal marshal, a criminal brought to justice, and underneath it all, the possibility of a life fundamentally different from the one he'd been living. Sarah relieved him at midnight, and he tried to sleep but couldn't quite manage it. His mind kept turning over questions. What would Tom Hadley say when he heard the full story? What would the people of Copper Ridge think of him now? Would they see him as lucky, or would they resent his fortune? How long before claim jumpers and desperados started showing up, looking for their share? He must have dozed eventually because he woke to Solomon's braying. Not the contented sounds the donkey had been making, but sharp alarm calls that brought both him and Sarah to their feet instantly. Dawn was breaking, and in the pale light they saw horses at the canyon entrance. 3 riders, all armed, moving cautiously forward. Elias reached for his rifle, but Sarah put a hand on his arm. Wait, look at their bearing. The riders moved with discipline, spread out tactically, rifles held ready but not aimed. As they came closer, Elias could see they wore badges, territorial marshals, legitimate law enforcement. The lead rider was a man in his 50s with a thick mustache and hard eyes. He reined in 20 yards from their camp and called out, "Federal Marshal Sarah Brennan?" "That's me," Sarah called back. "Identify yourself." "Marshal James Garrett, Montana Territorial Office. I've got a telegram from Judge Wheeler authorizing me to provide support for your investigation." He gestured to his companions. "These are deputies, Morrison and Blake. We heard you might need assistance. Sarah lowered her weapon and walked forward. You made good time. I wasn't expecting support for another week. Wheeler pushed it through. Holloway's apparently more connected than we thought. The judge wanted to make sure you had backup. Garrett's eyes moved to Elias, then to the canyon, taking in the exposed quartz and the gold-tinted stream. He whistled low. The stories are true. This is Elias Crane, Sarah said. The claim is his. We were planning to ride to Silver Creek today to file the paperwork. No need. I've got the forms right here. Garrett dismounted and pulled a leather satchel from his saddle. Wheeler figured you'd want this handled fast and legal. I'm authorized to witness and validate the claim on behalf of the territorial government. Over the next hour, forms were filled out, signatures witnessed, measurements recorded. Garrett worked with professional efficiency, documenting everything that would be needed to establish Elias's legal ownership of the canyon and its mineral rights. When it was done, he handed Elias a signed and sealed copy of the claim. Congratulations, Mr. Crane. As of this moment, you're the legal owner of what appears to be one of the richest gold deposits in the Montana Territory. Garrett's tone was neutral, but his eyes held a warning. I'd recommend you keep this quiet for as long as possible. Once word gets out, this canyon will be the most dangerous place in the territory. Men have killed for far less. I understand. Do you? Garrett looked around the canyon thoughtfully. I've seen what gold does to people, Mr. Crane. Good people, honest people, they turn into something else when wealth is involved. You'll need protection, legal counsel, armed guards. You'll need to trust very few people and question everyone's motives. It's a hard way to live. He won't be alone, Sarah said quietly. I'll be helping him establish the operation properly. Garrett raised an eyebrow. Wheeler mentioned you might be staying on for additional work. Fine by me, you're one of the best investigators I've seen. Just remember that when you're protecting a claim this valuable, the threats won't always come from obvious criminals. Sometimes they come from people wearing badges. Sometimes they come from the territorial government itself. The warning hung in the air. Elias felt the weight of it, the understanding that finding gold was just the beginning of a much longer, more complicated story. Garrett and his deputies prepared to leave, but before mounting, the marshal turned back. One more thing. Reed Holloway escaped custody last night. Killed the deputy, transporting him, and disappeared. We've got men looking, but I wanted you to know. He's out there, and he knows about this canyon. Watch yourselves. Then the marshals were gone, riding back through the canyon entrance and leaving Elias and Sarah standing in the morning light with Solomon and a fortune that had just become infinitely more dangerous to possess. Sarah checked her revolver, her expression grim. We need to move fast, get enough samples to prove the claim's value, then get back to civilization and start organizing proper security. Holloway will come back, Elias said. It wasn't a question. Yes, he's got nothing left to lose now, which makes him more dangerous than ever. She looked at Elias steadily. This is where things get difficult. Are you ready for that? Elias looked at Solomon, at the canyon, at the exposed vein of gold that promised wealth and danger in equal measure. He thought about his simple homestead, his quiet life, all the years of just getting by. That life was over now, whether he wanted it to be or not. Ready or not, he said. We don't have much choice. Let's get to work. They worked through the morning, extracting samples of the gold-bearing quartz, carefully selecting pieces that showed the richest concentrations. Sarah catalogued each sample, wrapping them in cloth and securing them in saddlebags. Elias focused on the exposed vein itself, using his pickaxe to break free chunks of rock that glittered with promise. Solomon wandered the canyon contentedly, occasionally rolling in his favorite mud patch, seemingly oblivious to the tension his two human companions carried. Or perhaps not oblivious, perhaps simply wise enough to know that worry accomplished nothing. Around noon, while Elias was working high on the rock face and Sarah was by the stream, Solomon suddenly went rigid. His ears shot forward, his body tense with alert focus. Then he brayed, sharp, urgent, warning. Elias dropped from the rock face and grabbed his rifle just as the first shot cracked across the canyon. The bullet struck stone 2 feet from Sarah's position, spraying rock fragments. She dove for cover behind a boulder, drawing her revolver in one smooth motion. "Elias," she called. "Get to cover." He was already moving, scrambling toward a cluster of rocks that offered protection. Another shot whined past his head, close enough that he felt the air displacement. He threw himself behind the rocks and brought his rifle up, scanning the canyon entrance. Reed Holloway emerged from cover, moving with the confidence of a man who believed he held all the advantages. He had a rifle in his hands, and another figure moved behind him, someone Elias didn't recognize, likely one of the men who'd been with Holloway at the trapper's cabin. "Mr. Crane," Holloway called out, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "I believe we have unfinished business." "You're a wanted man, Holloway," Sarah shouted back. "Every marshal in the territory is looking for you. Killing us won't help you, won't it? Once you're dead, there won't be any witnesses to what happened at that cabin. Won't be anyone to testify about my supposed crimes." He took several steps closer, using rock formations for cover. "And I'll have control of the richest gold strike in Montana. Seems like a fair trade." Elias's hands tightened on his rifle. He'd hunted game his whole life, had shot at targets and varmints, but he'd never fired at another human being, never faced the prospect of taking a life. The thought made his stomach clench, but he forced the feeling down. This wasn't about choice anymore. This was about survival. "Last chance," Holloway called. "Come out with your hands up, and maybe I'll let you walk away. Stay hidden, and I'll flush you out." "Don't trust him," Sarah hissed from her position. "He can't let us live. We know too much." She was right. Elias could see it in Holloway's stance, hear it in his voice. This would end in blood, one way or another. Then Solomon did something unexpected. The donkey, instead of fleeing or hiding, walked directly toward Holloway. Not quickly, just a steady, deliberate walk, as if he were approaching a familiar person who might have treats. "Solomon, no!" Elias called out, but the donkey ignored him. Holloway watched Solomon approach with visible confusion. "What the hell?" Solomon reached Holloway and stopped directly in front of him, blocking his line of fire to both Elias and Sarah. The donkey stood there, patient and immovable, his body creating a living shield. For a moment, everyone froze. Holloway lowered his rifle slightly, staring at the donkey. "Get out of the way, you stupid animal." Solomon didn't move. Holloway raised the rifle again, clearly intending to shoot Solomon to clear his line of fire. That's when Elias acted without thinking. He stood from cover, exposed and vulnerable, his rifle aimed directly at Holloway. "Don't," Elias said. His voice was steady despite the fear coursing through him. "Don't shoot that donkey." Holloway swung his rifle toward Elias. For a heartbeat, they stood there, 2 men with weapons trained on each other, separated by 40 yards of open ground and one stubborn donkey. Elias could see Holloway's finger tightening on the trigger, could see the decision being made. Sarah fired first. Her shot wasn't aimed to kill, she was still a marshal, bound by law and conscience, but to disable. The bullet caught Holloway in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his rifle clattering to the ground. The man behind Holloway, his companion, raised his own weapon, but Elias was already moving. He fired once, deliberately wide, a warning shot that sent rock fragments spraying near the man's position. The message was clear: back down, or the next one won't miss. The man dropped his rifle and raised his hands, smart enough to know when the odds had turned against him. Holloway fell to his knees, clutching his shoulder. Blood seeped between his fingers, but the wound wasn't fatal. Sarah approached cautiously, her revolver trained on him, while Elias covered the other man. "It's over, Reed," Sarah said quietly. But even as she said it, Elias saw Holloway's good hand reaching for something in his belt. Not a gun, something smaller, a knife. Time seemed to slow. Holloway pulled the knife and lunged not at Sarah, but at Solomon, who still stood nearby. a final act of spite, destroying what he couldn't possess. Elias didn't remember making the decision to fire. His body moved on pure instinct, pure necessity. The rifle bucked against his shoulder. The report echoed across the canyon. Holloway dropped, the knife falling from his hand. He crumpled to the ground and didn't move again. The silence that followed the gunshot was absolute. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Elias stood with the rifle still raised, smoke curling from the barrel, his entire body trembling from shock and adrenaline. He'd never killed a man before, never imagined he would. The weight of it settled on him like a physical thing, heavy and cold. Sarah moved to Holloway's fallen form, checking for a pulse, even though they both knew what she'd find. After a moment, she looked up and shook her head. Then she turned to the other man, who remained frozen with his hands raised. "Name," she demanded. "Carl Brenner, ma'am. I was just hired help. Holloway paid me to come along, said it was legitimate business. I didn't know, I swear I didn't know he was wanted. Sit down. Hands on your head, don't move." Sarah secured him with rope from her saddlebags, working efficiently despite the grim circumstances. Then she walked over to Elias, who hadn't moved from his position. "Elias," she said gently, "you can lower the rifle now." He looked at her as if seeing her from a great distance. "I killed him. You saved Solomon's life, and probably mine." Holloway was going to keep coming until someone stopped him permanently. She reached out and carefully took the rifle from his hands. "You did what you had to do. I've never—" his voice broke. "I've never shot a man before. I know." Sarah guided him to sit on a nearby rock. "And I'm sorry you had to. But Elias, listen to me. This wasn't murder. This was defense. He came here to kill us, to take what wasn't his. You stopped him the only way you could." Solomon approached slowly and nuzzled Elias's shoulder. The simple gesture of animal affection broke through the shock. Elias reached up and stroked the donkey's neck, feeling the solid warmth of living creature beneath his hand. Solomon was alive. Sarah was alive. That had to count for something. "What happens now?" he asked quietly. "Now I document everything. Witness statements, physical evidence, the legal justification for what occurred here. Marshal Garrett will need a full report. There'll be a hearing probably, but it's clear-cut self-defense. No jury in the territory would convict you." Over the next hour, Sarah worked with professional detachment, photographing the scene with a camera she'd brought specifically for documenting evidence. She recorded positions, measurements, timelines. She took a statement from Carl Brenner, who swore tearfully that he'd never fired his weapon, that he'd been coerced into coming along, that he'd testify to anything required. Elias sat with Solomon, watching the process, but not really participating. His mind kept replaying the moment Holloway lunging with the knife, the decision to fire, the finality of it. He told himself Sarah was right, that it had been necessary, but necessity didn't make it feel any less like carrying a stone in his chest. Finally, the work was done. They wrapped Holloway's body in canvas and secured it to his horse. Brenner would ride with them back to the nearest marshal station, where he'd give his formal testimony and face whatever charges came from his involvement, however peripheral. "We should leave soon," Sarah said, checking the sun's position. "It's a long ride, and I don't want to be in this canyon after dark." "What about the claim? The gold?" "The claim's filed and legal. The gold isn't going anywhere. We'll come back with proper security, proper equipment. Right now, we need to get out of here and handle the immediate situation." She paused. "Are you ready to ride?" Elias stood slowly, testing his legs, making sure they'd support him. Everything felt distant, dreamlike, as if he were watching himself from outside his own body. But he could function. He could ride. He could do what needed doing. They loaded their gear, secured the samples they'd collected, and prepared to leave. Before mounting, Elias took one last look at the canyon, at the gold-bearing quartz vein, at the stream with its golden tint, at the place where his life had changed irrevocably. This had been Solomon's home, and for a brief moment it had been a place of promise and possibility. Now it was also the place where Elias had taken a life. That knowledge would stay with him, would color every decision he made about the wealth this canyon represented. Gold wasn't clean or simple. It came with cost, always. Sometimes that cost was higher than anyone should have to pay. Solomon walked beside Tucker as they left the canyon, occasionally looking back as if saying goodbye to a place he'd known well. Elias reached down and patted the donkey's head. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for everything." The afternoon sun cast long shadows as they rode south, leaving the box canyon behind. Ahead lay questions and hearings and the complicated process of building something from the discovery they'd made. Behind lay a body wrapped in canvas and the echoes of a gunshot that would ring in Elias's memory for the rest of his life. But Solomon walked steady and sure, and Sarah rode beside him like a friend who'd stand witness to both his best and worst moments. And somehow, that made the road ahead feel possible to travel, even with the weight he now carried, even with everything that had changed. They had survived, and sometimes survival was enough to build a life on. Everything else, wealth, security, peace, those would have to be earned day by day, choice by choice. The mountains rose around them, ancient and indifferent to human struggle. The trail wound through pine forest and over rocky passes. And 3 humans, 3 horses, and 1 remarkable donkey moved through the wilderness toward whatever future waited for them in the world beyond. 6 months later, Elias stood at the entrance to the Box Canyon and watched the spring runoff swell the golden stream. The winter had been hard, not in weather, but in the weight of everything that had happened. The hearing had gone as Sarah predicted. Clear self-defense, no charges filed. Carl Brenner had testified honestly, confirming every detail of Holloway's threats and intentions. The territorial marshal had shaken Elias's hand and told him he'd done what any reasonable man would do. But knowing something in your mind and feeling it in your heart were different things. Elias had spent many long winter nights sitting by his cabin fire, thinking about that moment in the canyon, about the choice he'd made and the life he'd taken. He'd never arrived at peace with it, not entirely, but he'd arrived at acceptance. Sometimes the world forced impossible choices, and you lived with the consequences as best you could. The canyon looked different now. A proper mining operation had been established, nothing too large or aggressive, just enough to extract the gold systematically while preserving the land. Elias had hired Tom Hadley to manage the day-to-day operations, paying him a generous salary and a small share of the profits. Tom had brought in experienced miners who knew how to work a claim without destroying it in the process. Sarah had stayed true to her word about partnership. They'd split the initial wealth 3 ways: Elias, Sarah, and a trust fund established for the families of miners who'd been cheated by Reed Holloway's schemes. It had been Sarah's idea, a way of turning something tainted into something redemptive. Elias had agreed immediately. The wealth was substantial, more than Elias would have earned in 10 lifetimes of drift riding and cattle ranching, but he'd been careful with it, practical. He'd improved his homestead, expanded his herd, hired help to ease the daily burden of ranch work. He'd bought better equipment, better horses. But he hadn't tried to become someone he wasn't. The cabin was still a cabin, not a mansion. His clothes were still canvas and cotton, not silk and wool. Some things had changed, though. His reputation, for one. The story of the diseased donkey and the hidden gold strike had spread across the territory and beyond. Newspapers as far as San Francisco had run articles about the miracle discovery and the shootout with the corrupt speculator. Elias had become famous in a way he'd never wanted or sought. People treated him differently now, with deference that made him uncomfortable, with speculation about his intentions that he found wearying. But other changes were better. Sarah had resigned her marshal's commission and devoted herself to legal advocacy for miners and prospectors. She'd opened an office in Copper Ridge, providing counsel to people who couldn't afford the expensive lawyers in the big cities. She and Elias remained close friends, meeting weekly to discuss the canyon's operations and share meals that felt like family. And then there was Solomon. The donkey had become something of a legend himself. People came from miles around to see the animal that had worn fortune on his back, that had stood between his owner and a killer's blade. Children brought him apples and carrots. Artists sketched him. One enterprising journalist had tried to buy him for exhibition in eastern cities. Elias had refused every offer, every request. Solomon lived at the homestead now, in a new barn Elias had built. He had a large pasture, other animals for company, including a mare who'd taken a particular liking to him, and all the alfalfa he could eat. His coat had grown in healthy and full, free from the resinous gold that had made him appear diseased. He looked like what he was, a middle-aged donkey living a comfortable life. But sometimes, on warm spring days, Elias would take Solomon back to the canyon. He'd let the donkey roll in his favorite mud patch, coating himself once again in pine, resin, and gold. Not because the gold mattered anymore, but because Solomon seemed happiest when he could indulge in his peculiar habit. And if there was anything Elias had learned from all of this, it was that happiness for people and animals alike was worth preserving wherever it could be found. Today, watching Solomon roll contentedly in the mud, Elias thought about the day he'd first seen this donkey at the Copper Ridge auction. Everyone had laughed. Everyone had seen disease and worthlessness. He'd looked deeper and found fortune. But the real treasure hadn't been the gold. It had been the reminder that value often hides beneath surfaces, that compassion leads to unexpected places, that taking a chance on something broken can reveal strengths you didn't know you possessed. Tom appeared beside him, wiping sweat from his forehead after a morning's work supervising the mining crew. "We pulled out another good load today. The vein keeps producing. It's remarkable." "It is," Elias agreed. "You know, half the territory still thinks you're the luckiest man alive. Maybe I am. And the other half thinks you're crazy for not selling out to one of the big mining companies. They've made you incredible offers." "They have," Elias smiled slightly. "But I've got everything I need. The claim produces enough to live well, to help others, to make a difference. Taking more just for the sake of having it, that doesn't appeal to me." Tom nodded, understanding. Jack Brennan would have approved. He always said the best fortune was the one you could sleep with at night. Solomon finished his mud bath and shook himself vigorously, sending droplets of gold-flecked resin flying. He trotted over to Elias and nuzzled his hand, leaving muddy streaks on his sleeve. Elias scratched behind the donkey's ears, feeling the simple contentment of the moment. In the distance, the Bitterroot Mountains rose against a clear blue sky, the same mountains that had witnessed violence and discovery, loss and redemption, the same mountains that had tested him and revealed something he hadn't known about himself, that when pressed, he could protect what mattered, could make impossible choices, could survive tragedy, and come out the other side still capable of compassion. Sarah's wagon appeared on the canyon trail, right on schedule for their weekly meeting. She waved, and Elias waved back. Tom excused himself to return to the mine operations. And Elias stood there with Solomon, watching his friend approach, thinking about how strange and circular life could be. He'd bought a broken-looking donkey for $1 because it had seemed like the right thing to do. That simple act of kindness had led to wealth, danger, partnership, and profound change. It had cost him his anonymity and his innocence about violence, but it had also given him purpose, connection, and the knowledge that even at 53, even after decades of just getting by, transformation was still possible. Sometimes the most broken-looking things hold the greatest treasures. He'd said that at the auction, not knowing how true it would prove. Not just about Solomon, but about himself, about the worn-down drift rider who'd thought his best years were behind him, who'd discovered that life still had surprises waiting, still had adventures to offer, still had chances to become more than he'd been. The sun warmed his shoulders. Solomon stood beside him, mud-covered and content. Sarah's wagon drew closer. The canyon held its gold and its secrets, and Elias Crane, former nobody, current fortune holder, stood in the middle of his transformed life and felt something he hadn't felt in years. He felt grateful, for chances taken, for kindness offered, for the reminder that you're never too old to find something worth fighting for, worth living for, worth rolling in the mud over. And that, more than any amount of gold, was treasure enough for any life.